Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show here on The Real News. I'm Marc Steiner, and it's great to have you all with us. A year ago, on January the 6th, America witnessed the violent takeover of the United States Capitol. Some would label it an insurrection. Now, Trump clearly enjoyed the moment and exhorted them on. Now, 71 people have gone to trial, mostly on minor charges, and the House has created a select committee to investigate how officials and some congressional representatives were complicit in supporting that takeover. Now, those are the headlines. But what lies behind the headlines? What does that moment last January 6th portend for the future? What does it mean that at least 43 million voting-age Americans who supported it also think the election was stolen? How organized is the right? What does 1877 in America and 1932 in Germany have to teach us about this moment? If this is the root of a right-wing takeover of our nation and society, how do we respond? One of our guests today is Bill Fletcher, Jr., who's been a racial justice, labor, and international activist for a long time, author of numerous books, including They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions, and Solidarity Divided, and his mystery novel that I personally love, The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And Bill and I are working together on a series for you on the rise of the right and what can be done. We're also joined once again by Rick Perlstein. He's president of the journal In These Times, author of numerous books, including Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater, and The Unmaking of American Consensus, and Nixonland, The Rise of the President, and the Fracturing of America, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon, and the Rise of Reagan, and his most recent book, Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 and 1980. So he's been looking at this right-wing movement for a long while now. And gentlemen, welcome. Good to have you both with us.
Wonderful to be on board.
So let's just begin. I'm really curious both of your perspectives on what this moment really says, how serious a moment it is that we're facing, and what is the establishment media missing in this conversation? Bill, let me start with you and we'll jump to Rick.
So I think, Mark, what's important about this moment is that we're looking at a crisis of constitutional democracy. And so we've seen the Republican Party morph into a party for dictatorship. A party that embraced the coup attempt of January 6th, a party that is encouraging gangs to attack election officials, I should say, as well as voters. And so this is a different kind of moment. This is not a moment simply of a clash of Republicans versus Democrats. It's not even a clash of the kind of Newt Gingrich Republicans. We're looking at something different. And I think Steve Bannon and others have been very clear that they're looking for a different form of governance. And those are their words. And so what I think is happening within the mainstream media and within much of the Democratic Party leadership is this notion that the institutions of U.S. democracy can contain this kind of virus, and that there's nothing special that needs to be done. And I think they're making a tremendous mistake.
Rick?
Wow. I think that the subject of what the media is missing may be the biggest, maybe the biggest part of all this. I've been kind of trying to pull together my thoughts on, the totality of what we're talking about. This hinge movement for America's Republican form of government, small r Republican, obviously. And I've been going back really kind of to the beginning of the American project, and kind of theorizing that there's always been this kind of reactionary minority that believes that the country is theirs to rule. I mean, it was the slaveocracy before the Civil War. It was, basically the post-Reconstruction, kind of attempt to kind of recreate that in all but name. It's, generally been rooted in the South, but one of the most important things in the history I've been writing about, talking about the right from the 50s until the present, is the nationalization of that kind of Southern anti-democratic, feudalist project. my favorite quote is the Barry Goldwater delegate from the South in 1964, who when Goldwater won the nomination, said, "We moved the Mason-Dixon line up to Canada," right? And the important thing to understand about this formation that's pretty consistent across American history, basically, white male patriarchy uber alles, has been that it's perfectly willing to use the formal instruments of democracy if it can get its way using those. And when it can't, it's always adverted to violence, whether it is the Civil War or Klan terrorism in the 1870s and moving forward, or the era when they were dumping African American boys in rivers in the 1950s, or January 6th. And you just really kind of see this with a special clarity now. And the issue of the media and all this is probably the most fascinating piece in all of it. And in my kind of second last previous book, The Invisible Bridge, which covered 1973 to 1976, I talk about what happened after the Vietnam War, and I use the metaphor of what happened in 1877, when basically the reactionary minority, did what Trump tried to do, in 2020, which was basically kind of con their way into being able to maintain white supremacy, this dirty deal with the Republicans that gave the Republicans the presidency so long as they took the troops out of the South. And I quote the New York Times, right? Kind of the ancient ghosts of the New York Times now, saying, well, all these abolitionists are, talking about what's happening in the South, and they're saying, we're going back to what it was like before the war, but really only the tiny suspicious circles, care about that stuff, right? This elite wish to kind of wish away the intellectual conflict, and in the case of Trump and what's happening now, the metaphor people use is normalization, right? That if you read Politico and the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're willing to use the word lie when it comes to Trump now. But basically, they're talking about, the upcoming off-year elections as if it's an election, right? And not an apocalyptic confrontation between people who believe in the formal, kind of raiments of democracy and people who believe that anyone who's liberal or minority or isn't part of their tribe is not a legitimate partner in governing the country, and is willing to enforce that, as Bill says, through arms, through violence. And the media is just kind of constitutionally unprepared to think about that, right? The way in which this has been a long time coming, the way in which, just enormous amounts of Americans, again, that reactionary minority, have basically begged off of democracy, right? And so I've been thinking about this, and I've been putting it together for a possible book, and I just I apportion tripartite blame, right? It's the authoritarian ratchet of the Republican Party. The elites let it happen, the Republican elites. It's the fecklessness of the Democratic Party. Obama, the moment, the Republicans were willing to kind of grind the government to a halt, in order to, force their reactionary aims, was when he should have, kind of rang the alarm bells, right? And that's way back in, 2011, 2012, 2013. And then the media, which systematically deranges America's citizens' ability to understand what's going on. So it's very dire stuff. And the fact that nature is not cooperating with us, my great hope was that Biden would be able to restore a little bit of the public's trust in government as a force in their lives by getting this, pandemic in hand. And the pandemic didn't cooperate. So I'm very frightened.
So Bill, do you have anything you want to say before I jump into these? Because there's 3 areas I really want to jump into, but if you have a response or a thought from what you just heard. And
Yeah, no, I agree with much of what Rick was laying out. I think that the other thing that needs to be stated here about the media is people should watch that classic film Network from 1977. Because I think that movie, for those that never saw it, revolves around the combination of a news host who goes nuts and then starts yelling, "I'm sick of this and I won't take it anymore." And people start responding, and the network decides to manipulate him and events in order to increase their network share, their media share, despite the consequences as they start pushing things and they get tied up with this urban guerrilla group, etc. Now, at the time that this came out, people thought it was absurd, a very good satire, but basically absurd. But when you look at the way that the media responded to Trump from 2015 on, actually prior to that with the birther movement, you see a similar pattern, that this notion that you take advantage of a perceived nut in order to increase your media share, that people will pay greater and greater attention the more extreme the situation is. Now, one of the things that means is that each time the situation becomes more extreme, it means that things that were done earlier, and this relates to your point about normalization, Rick, things that were done earlier that were outrageous seem less outrageous, because each step in the move towards greater irrationalism makes other steps seem mild. And people get used to a completely a situation where things are unraveling. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's correct to raise criticisms of the media and to the media around this, but also ringing the bell to the broader public that this is a real problem. Now, the one thing I'll hasten to add is that I think it's important to remind people that what we're experiencing is not unprecedented. And I don't say that in order to calm people, but in order to put things into context, that we have seen repeated examples of threats, authoritarian threats, over the history of the United States, whether it was, as we were talking about, the end of Reconstruction, the 1898 coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, the various lynchings that have taken place, the destruction of the Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the rise in the 30s of various fascist groups like the Black Legion, the Silver Shirts, etc. These things, this is part of the herpes of U.S. capitalism. And I think that we have to remind people constantly that this kind of right-wing populism is very much in the system. This is not an aberration. This is part of the system.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to have an opposition party willing to kind of say that, instead of saying, as Obama did for 8 years, well, if we just kind of are calmly, charismatically rational, we can kind of make the fever break. And while this is all happening, speaking of capitalism, it's like Lenin, talking about capitalists kind of, selling the working class the rope. You got this particularly crushing brand of capitalists who creates computer programs, algorithms, that literally operationalizes the process you're talking about, Bill.
That's right.
That's the algorithm that basically shoves in people's faces conflict, because that generates clicks. Someone figured out, some computer programmer, that you can get people to kind of gawk at their screen, more addictively when you start some kind of irrational fight. Mm-hmm. And that's an awful development, right? And it's like network factorialized,
And I was thinking, as you two were talking, that 2 points here for me that you said so much that one is historical and one is the moment in the future. Let me start with the historical in the time we have left and then jump to the moment and the future. So I am obsessed with kind of looking at both 1877 and 1932, and also the years between 1930 and early 70s. And I was thinking about how that in 1877, the end of Reconstruction, the beginning of 90 years of terror against the Black world, enhanced terror, I should say, in the Black world. It also had to do with legions of former soldiers, both mostly Confederate, but both Union and Confederate, and the forming of the KKK, and the power of the South rising again politically, and the destruction of what could be considered close to the contemporary left, with the folks who wanted Reconstruction, with the parts of the radical Republicans who were really trying to build a different America, and that was crushed. You look at 1932. You look at Adolf Hitler. You look at his minority government. When he took power, it was because the Center Party went into an alignment with the Nazis to create a majority government, allowing Hitler to take over and to push and to blame. They didn't have any black folks. It was the Jews that decided that were the fault of all this. And they pushed this kind of right-wing terror, and this fascistic government took over. And we saw the results of that. And then we have, and so in our modern era, it seems to me, we have from the 1930s to the early 70s, you had this push to build a different kind of America. And it went through a lot of struggles internally. And the power of the civil rights movement really altered that and began to change things in a major way in terms of our country. And you add on to that the anti-war movement that gave birth to the women's movement and the environmental movement. And that began to change kind of the culture of the country in many ways. And there was this massive pushback from the right that began in the early 70s.
Yep.
From Lewis Powell, who later became justice, to this moment that we're facing at this moment. So if we look at that history for just a second, what does that history tell us about what we should be thinking about? History can't define this moment.
Right.
But it give us a sense of what we face and what we keep missing in what we face.
I think if I may, I'm seeing with a little more clarity that all these moments of reactionary peril, the sociological parallel is that you have, or a political parallel, is that you have a reactionary minority party that has a parliamentary and a paramilitary wing. And the Republicans are just reproducing this pattern with just, elegance, right? And if you look at the January 6th investigation, they're proceeding on 2 tracks. And the 2 tracks are the majority, literally the majority of senators and House members who tried to overturn their elections using their votes. As outside the gates, you have, people kind of massing, with truncheons, right? And you have to kind of follow that thread. In 2020, you talk about, the movement, for Black lives, at the same time as I think it was about a dozen states were indemnifying people for the crime of driving their vehicles, vehicular homicide, into crowds, right? And if you look at the statistics, I think there were something like, there were nearly 100 vehicular assaults. This is terrorism, right? The automobile as a weapon, and kind of pushing back, movements for democracy and equality. And you just, we need to be, and I think, and then as we look at this January 6th investigation, you have this House committee that seems to be doing very aggressive work, and this Justice Department that seems to be, nowhere to be found because they're quote unquote institutionalists. That's where you get into the Democratic Party fecklessness, where we have this Attorney General who, hopefully is building these cases from the ground up, but we don't know. We haven't heard anything, right? So we have no kind of organized voice within the Democratic Party who is saying, really kind of naming the stakes with any kind of clarity and aggressiveness. The that has the power to do something about it, or maybe not. And that's why we're kind of on the precipice, and, you still have this kind of Adlai Stevenson kind of Obama strain in the Democratic Party that says the problem is polarization, and we're saying too many mean things about the opposition, right? And that's a real problem.
And Bill,
yeah. So I think it's really important that people don't leave this show and commit suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So I really do, and it's not just because I'm a great humanitarian. See, first of all, I think I'm going to say two things that will sound perhaps paradoxical. One is that I think this moment was inevitable. The second is that I do not think that the outcome is inevitable. So I think that this moment was inevitable because this is the result of racial settler colonialism. This is the result of the failure of the Civil War to actually resolve the part of the question. And it was also the result of the fact that during this great democratic, small d, moment in the South called Reconstruction, Native Americans were being annihilated in the West, right? So you had these contradictory things that were going on. So so I think that the failure of the United States to ever come to grips with its own past and with the question of a genuine democracy, even within the context of capitalism, made this inevitable, this clash. And I think that when I talked before about right-wing populism as the herpes of capitalism, it's because the virus is in the system. It's not outside of the system and periodically like a stomach bug hitting you, right? It's in the system. So the system needs to be cleansed. And so the outcome of this clash is not inevitable. So we have at least 70% of the population that has not lost its mind. I mean, that's very significant. And I think that what is critically important, and Mark, you and I have talked about this, is that people have to organize at the base. And it can't be relying on the eloquence of Barack Obama or the feistiness of Biden in order to stop this plague. When the right shows up at school board meetings, we need to be there. When the right attacks or tries to stop the vaccine, we need to be there. When they come after election officials, we need to be there. Now, I realize the implications of this. I realize that may lead to physical altercations. But in general, I have found the right to be quite cowardly. This is true not just in the United States, but in other places. They are bullies. And they often think they can get away quite literally with murder until and unless progressives stand up and say, no pasaran. We're not playing this game.
Yep.
And we should remember just historically, the Spanish fascists in 1936 could have been defeated in a matter of months had it not been for the Nazis and the Italian fascists intervening. We can actually stop this thing from happening. So I think it's really important that we do not fall prey to fatalism, which I see certainly in the liberal media, but also in segments of the left. And one final thing, Mark, there's also segments of the left, you and I have discussed, that really downplay this danger from right-wing authoritarianism and continue to think that the main enemy are centrist Democrats. I want to go upside people's heads and ask them, what are you smoking? What is it? Is it like alcohol and herb, or are you adding some other stuff in there? What is it that you think is going on here?
Yeah.
Right? So I think we just have to grapple with that.
So let me jump in here for a minute. And you two just brought us to this moment. let's talk about this moment. What you just said really means, Bill, and what you were saying earlier, Rick. So how does that happen, though? Let me posit something that may sound negative, but let me just posit it anyway, and we can tear it apart. Okay. So I'm watching the right, and I see a right wing that appears to be more organized than progressives of the left or anybody else, and well-funded and well-armed, I might add. In all these conflagrations that we talked about, whether it was Hitler in 1930, Germany in 1932, or 1877, or right now, a lot of it is being fueled by, take that back. That part of it is that people who have been in the military are upset and angry and on the right. As my two grandsons who now serve in the United States Army said to me, that almost all the guys they meet in the combat units are on the right, as opposed to the units they're in when they're much more open-minded, because they're in the Space Corps and all that kind of stuff. So they're in a very different kind of place. But so that reality exists. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the right wing inside the Republican Party has literally control of 26 states in the Union. And in 41 states, they have put in legislation to diminish voting rights and to control the vote so they can control the elections coming up. And that means that they could possibly, for numerous reasons, including the failure of Biden and others, to take over in 2022 the federal legislature, which is significant. And the left is and progressives are kind of embedded inside the Democratic Party. And I'm not saying here, go start another party that has no power at the moment, but that are embedded inside the Democrats with very little power within them. And the unions are now struggling to get back on their feet, and you see strikes taking place and people organizing, but the power of the unions are not what they were. So what do we mean? And what do you mean? But when you say now it's time to kind of stand up, I mean, I understand standing up to them. And even in my dotage here, I'm willing to stand up against these fools. but the question is, what does that mean if we are not organized to really confront, either in the street, polls, or in the community, in the elections, in school boards, and more? So so what is it going to take to really stop them? Is the question I'm asking the two of you.
Well, Mark, the Democratic Party didn't organize the civil rights movement. The Democratic Party didn't organize the Chicano moratorium in 1970, right? The Democratic Party didn't organize Stonewall, right? I mean, so I think it's really important that people break with passivity and start thinking about, okay, how do we organize? Like I've been talking for years about the necessity to organize democracy brigades. And my critical image was the union leagues of the 1860s and 1870s that were organized based particularly among African Americans, but also among poor whites, to fight to advance Reconstruction. The problem there is that they didn't take the necessary steps to ultimately smash the white terrorists. But I think that we need to be thinking at the local level of building brigades of people, volunteers, that are engaged in this fight for democracy. And I think that the longer that we sit back and we wait for something to come out of Congress or out of the White House, it ain't going to happen. And I agree with you, Rick, I keep hoping that the Justice Department is working something up. And I actually think that they probably are. But man, are they quiet. Yeah. And so I think that that's necessary. I mean, I want to see at a school board meeting, when these lunatics show up, I want to see our forces there, right? And basically saying to these lunatics, do you want to debate about critical race theory? Let's have the damn debate. But you are not going to bully this board into some ridiculous stuff, like these different pieces of legislation are being passed in various state legislatures.
Book burning.
We have got to, we can't, we are our own liberators. We're the ones that are going to have to constitute these organizations. And so it might not be entire national unions. It might be local unions. It might be NAACP chapters. It might be immigrant rights groups, right? that come together, even if on an ad hoc basis, and say, one of the things we're going to take up, making sure to protect these election officials, making sure that people can vote, making sure that vaccines happen, making sure to protect the right to abortion, right? That we're going to do this, and we're going to do it in the streets.
Rick, you want to jump in on that?
Well, yes. But
Really?
another thing is, I'm a big fan of a socialist thinker, Karl Polanyi, who points out that societies organized around market values always create, basically nihilistic apocalypses, and that there are always people within basically the ambit of capital and the ruling class who grasp this. And so we have allies within the ruling class, like, the Rockefellers who, in the 1860s and 70s, built a school system in the South for African Americans, right? Which was a very radical thing to do. So we have allies, and we have to search them out because these people grasp that if we're talking about a republic of insects and grass, as who was it, the great writer about nuclear apocalypse, that they don't win either. So power yields nothing without a demand. And after the urban rebellions of the 60s, one of the things that happened was employers were like, holy crap. If you read the Harvard Business Review, they were like, we need to bring African Americans into corporate America, right? So we have to find all sorts of pressure points, right? All sorts of pressure points, because we're talking about civilization or barbarism, and we might have allies that are not our usual allies, because we're talking about whether the thing, basically human life can be sustained on the planet. And so bottom up, top down, inside out, outside in, we gotta build a real popular front for democracy.
I want to just add to that. I agree with you 100%, Rick, and just point out that something that your comment triggered in response to the 50s and 60s. There was what you described, but there was also the response from the right, the what becomes a right-wing populist movement, and this politics of revanchism, that we see germinating in the late 60s and then spreading out. And I thought about that a lot after 2020, because we had this historic post George Floyd murder movement around the country, right? We had demonstrations, uprisings, everything. And so there were two responses. Part of corporate America and the political establishment responded with greater attention to so-called diversity, to re-examining U.S. history, et cetera, et cetera. But then there was equally this right-wing authoritarian backlash that I would argue that the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole was completely unprepared for, because that right-wing backlash was organizing. It wasn't just protesting. They were organizing. And the George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement was protesting, but did not create lasting organizations and points of pressure. It was predictable. It's what we saw in 1968, right? Nixon didn't appear out of nowhere. George Wallace didn't appear out of nowhere. It was a particular response that we have to always keep in mind. It's part of this virus in the U.S. system.
That's an interesting analogy. I mean, I think that's true. I mean, as someone who was in the midst of 1968, I think about all the failures of 68, that those of us who were too busy in the streets battling as opposed to in the community organizing. And I think that's part of the issue we face. But I'm glad we're getting this in kind of a positive note, that there is there's light at the end of this tunnel, and there's room to stop the right and to build something new. And I think that's really the kind of the message that we need to kind of push really hard.
That's right.
And I, we in the conversation today, both of you have been really great in kind of describing why we're here and also what we have to do to get there. And I do want to thank both of you for joining us today, and Rick Perlstein and Bill Fletcher. This has been a really good conversation. And I want to tell all the folks out there who are watching, listening to us today, that we're going to continue this conversation. That Bill Fletcher and I will be producing a whole series of conversations, not just about, oh, woe is me, but what can be done, why we're here, and what can we do. And I'll also be talking to organizers from across the country, the Poor People's Campaign and other organizations who are actually organizing on the ground. There is a way to stop this, and that's what we're going to focus on. We are in the middle of a battle for the future, and I think we're all here. And for me, who has children and grandchildren and waiting and even great-grandchildren, which is kind of scary to say, but I do, that it's for them. We're going to let them inherit a better society, not something that the right can control. And again, I want to thank you both so much, both for the work you do and for being with us here today on the Steiner Show on The Real News. It's always good to talk to both of you. I mean, it's really important to do that. Thank you both so much. And I want to thank you all for listening here today.
Yeah. With loving hearts like these, we can't fail.
Amen to that. And I want to, and all of you out there, remind you that here at The Real News, you can still go to realnews.com/donate, continue your donations to Real News to keep these things alive, and look to our reports on the rise of the right and other projects we'll be doing. I want to thank Dwayne Gladden and Stephen Frank for editing and monitoring this broadcast. And thank you all for watching today and listening to and being part of the Marc Steiner Show here on The Real News. Thank you, take care, and keep on fighting. Stay the course.